140 days every 2 years to changing that to 2 days every 140 years. Now, I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but that is kind of a unique approach. But nonetheless, the session is over. The statements have been made, the rules have been put forth, and now we're going to talk about what that means, and then also discuss a little bit about moving forward. Where do we go from here? What can we do to improve things in the state of Texas? And with us today, we have a distinguished panel, Representative Andrew Murr from Junction, Texas. I believe Junction's where you call home. Was elected the first time in 2014 to represent District 53. We also have Representative Burns. Cleburne, I believe, would be your home, a representative. We appreciate your service and the fact that you've taken time to be with us here today. And then also we've got Kacal with us, and Kyle is from, I guess, Central Texas would pretty well sum your location up. You're kind of right in the heart of Texas.
I like to claim that.
You'd like to claim that. Very good. We're going to talk about several issues this morning. Of course, we will have comments from the floor and questions from the floor, and that always makes it interesting. But I would like to kind of start the discussion, and we'll start out with each one of you giving us just a little overview of how you think the session went, what were some of the highlights for you, and then we'll get into more specifics and more detail as we go along. If you'd like to start, Representative.
Sure. One thing that you heard a little bit earlier about were the number of bills that were filed during the session. So total pieces of legislation added up to over 11,000, and that includes resolutions and bills. Of the bills, there were over 6,200 bills filed in the House and the Senate. If you look at how many bills were voted out of both the House and the Senate and sent to the governor's desk, your rate of success was about 21%. And you can look at it from both sides of the fence there. So one angle would be that 80% of legislation dies. But you can also look at it as that's a great way to kill bad ideas. And a lot of times you'll see duplication in the process, or you'll see someone who has a great idea that gets filed as a bill, but they don't think through the consequences. And oftentimes rural Texas can be an afterthought. And that's part of our process, is to educate those bill authors and educate those interest groups that are pushing for a certain change in the law, to realize that it may have implications where we live, and that they need to think through those ramifications before they go and haphazardly change something. And I think learning that process and being diligent about reviewing what we're considering is extremely important. And that's something that I personally feel like I owe folks back home.
Outstanding. Representative Burns.
You bet. I think I'll take a little bit of a different angle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget. As you mentioned, that's the one bill that we're constitutionally required to pass. So it's a high priority for everyone in the House and the Senate. And our state budget came in roughly $209 billion with a B. That's a lot of money. I don't know to you guys. To me, that's a ton. And but we were able to spend that $209 billion and still come in under our constitutional spending cap. Our budget increased from last session about 3%, 3.5% or so, and we were able to put away about $2.9 billion into the rainy day fund, which is going to increase the rainy day fund to about $11.1 billion. And all the while adding about $1.5 billion to education, public education, adding a little over $1 billion to transportation. And then we'll have a constitutional amendment coming up, and we'll have several of them. We might talk about them today, but one of them in particular is SJR 5 will be on the ballot, and that'll give us an opportunity to dedicate even more motor vehicle sales tax to general revenue for transportation, for funding maintenance and construction of roads, no toll roads or anything, but for the maintenance and construction of roads and paying off bond debt for transportation. So we were able to fund, in my opinion, add some money to some of our priorities, some of the areas that were lacking in the past, yet still, still stay under budget. And I think that just speaks to, in general, the success of Texas overall. And you hear people talk about the Texas miracle. And I think our regulatory structure in Texas, the way we do business here in Texas, the oil and gas industry in Texas, the agriculture industry in Texas, you wrap that all together, and that's what defines the Texas miracle. And I was pleased with our budget. So I'll close with that as far as that goes.
And we want to get back to that in a minute. But first, Representative Kacal.
It was a great session. One, I want to start off saying thank you for not only having us today, but as you look up here, you have 3 Farm Bureau County board members, 3 former county presidents. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And when I entered the 2013 session, kind of alone as a rural rep, you sent 2 good ones to help. And this session, not only we didn't have any extra time, we got done on June 1st, which was a blessing. Got to go back home to our families and to the farm and ranch, and life was good. But the intelligence that I have on my left and the team we have to work with, because you can get into all kinds of political ideology, but when it comes down to it, it's rural versus urban. And the team we have in the Texas House today, because of the people sitting in this room, I just want to say thank you, because it gave us the opportunity to get our job done, pass the budget, take care of education, look at water and water infrastructure, take care of the things we need to do to make this state successful and continue the economic growth, and make sure rural Texas plays its vital role in keeping Texas one of the best economic engines in the world. So thank you.
Very good. In fact, one of the things that I was amiss this morning by not introducing each one of these gentlemen as Farm Bureau board members. That's vitally important, and it's vitally important that we continue to keep our knowledgeable members out there of Texas Farm Bureau, and they're some of the best informed membership in the state of Texas as issues, to be involved in the legislative process, be involved in the political process, and it's very important that we have them there. You brought up an interesting point. There was a time in Texas when we considered the West Texas Coalition, that if you weren't on board with some of those senior members, basically out of West Texas representing rural Texas, you didn't get things done. But that's not true now, is it?
In a sense, no, but no. It's important to have relationships across the state. As I look out here and tell you how wonderful we did in the House, you've got some incredible opportunities in the Senate. So it's time to get engaged in those Senate races. The House, we went into this session with a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, a new ag commissioner, a new comptroller, a new land. I mean, it was all brand new except the Speaker of the House and the House. We had 25 new House members, which you're looking at 2 of them, so you take out 23 of those guys, because these 2 guys acted like veterans right off the bat, because they knew what they needed to do for rural Texas. But those relationships are key, and we'll have Charles Perry, Senator Perry, after us, I believe, today. And what an advocate he was for agriculture. When he left our chamber, went over there, I would have never thought that Charles and I would have had that many ag bills together, but glad that he went over there and we had some sane agricultural thought and common sense in the Senate.
In visiting with Senator Perry, the question always comes to me, is there anything that he doesn't have a pretty good understanding of? Because he is very well versed and can talk about many, many topics, and that's very good for a state legislature. Along those lines, gentlemen, as we look out at this last session, and we see the demographics of Texas, which we had a report on in this meeting yesterday, building that I-35 corridor, the fact that the majority of our population is now going to be I-35 and east, and we see our urban areas continuing to grow, and we've got issues out there where we're going to have rural and urban interests against it. What are a couple of the things that would come to mind that we really have some problems between those 2 interests, and where are the areas where we can work together to make things better in Texas? Anything come to mind between the urban and rural areas that we really need to watch for, either being something that's going to be that we're going to be fighting over, or something we're going to join hands in and work toward? Any thoughts?
I'll go ahead and begin. I think it comes to the top of most people's lists, and it's whether you have too much or not enough, but it's water. Absolutely. Surface water and groundwater. And there's always going to be conflict with those that have versus those that want or have not. And whenever you have that challenge between urban areas that have growth and rural areas that actually do have some supplies of surface or groundwater, you're going to have some conflict. And so that's incumbent upon us sitting on this stage right here to make sure that, one, we build good relationships with urban legislators so that we have the rapport with them, so we can have dialogue because at the end of the day, it's not just cities and counties, but it's actually going to be attempts to change state law to allow for interbasin transfers, to do other types of creative problem solving that those urban areas think that they need to do. And sometimes they may overlook us out in rural Texas. And so that's really important for us as legislators to build that relationship with them. Number two, we have to be vigilant on water because it is an ever-changing dynamic. So I can sit here and tell you, I ranch, and just like everybody else, I had to sell down my cows so that we could make it through the drought. But right now, we're enjoying more green than we've seen since 2007, and that is something exciting for everybody. That being said, we know drought is always imminent, and as a result of that, we have to plan for the future. And that's the second prong of what we've got to do is we have to be forward-thinking. We have to anticipate future needs and come up with ideas that may provide good solutions for that. So water for me is predominant. It's a big deal for the Hill Country.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I agree with Representative Murr that water is probably one of the areas that will be most impacted as we see the urban areas grow. In fact, when I went to the legislature, I made a commitment to fight for private property rights. And I think when we're able to discuss with our urban colleagues and those around the state that don't understand agriculture or haven't been involved, when we can convey to them the property right that exists with groundwater and start having those discussions about their fair share of a private property owner to the water that's under their property, it starts to click in their minds because they're coming at it from, we need water, you've got it, we'll just take it. And let me tell you what, folks, there's enough of them down there to do it. But when we convey that private property right aspect of it, and we fight for that, and we put it in law, and where it has to be considered and respected and honored, then I think that moves the ball in our direction. But urban sprawl is an issue that we're going to have to deal with as well. The jobs are in the populated areas, and people are moving to the populated areas, and they're overcrowded and sprawling out into the rural areas. So we've got to be careful when we decide, when we see legislation that may come across that's going to deal with our rollback tax exclusions and things like that. So we've just got to stay diligent and develop those relationships. The first day of the session, when I was sworn in, Senator Birdwell came up to me and said, I bet you're wondering how in the world you got here. I said, yes, sir, I am. And he said, well, in about 140 days, you're going to wonder how any of the rest of these people got here. And he's exactly right. But they're all well-intentioned, but it's about developing relationships with them and providing the information.
Absolutely.
Water is the key. These two fine gentlemen hit the nail on the head. We started off the session, DeWayne and I were both blessed to be on natural resources and water from an agriculture perspective. We had 7 of us were rural reps, which was a good thing, but we entered with the drought fresh on our mind through the session, and Chairman Keffer has been taking credit for this since the rains began. And when you talk about 40 trillion gallons of water running from the sky, we don't need to forget that the drought can come back. What is that, 8 inches of water across the entire state? We were truly blessed this spring. I'll just say this real quick, I was disappointed. I probably missed the best spring of my lifetime at the ranch, but I was glad that we were there fighting for this. Water's the key. I think it's time for us to lead the discussion. Coming in with the drought, we had a lot of interesting talks, whether it was the Day case, rule of capture back to 1904, or Chapter 36. Those things were always in our forethought in our mind, but agriculture in rural Texas, we need to lead the water discussion. We do not need to be playing defense the entire time. That water still belongs to us. It's a private property issue, but we need to lead these conversations. But for this state to continue to enjoy economic success, we're going to have to utilize that water and find a way to keep this economic engine running. And until oil comes back, it's nice that agriculture's kind of the #1 industry again.
You know,
I'm taking that no matter if or not.
yeah, just
People
take
need
credit.
to eat.
Take credit for
Yes.
that when you can.
that's right.
That's important. You know, one of the things that we've known forever in agriculture in Texas, and especially West Texas, and I consider that to be just about anything west of I-35, water is always our limiting factor. It always has been. We've got the other inputs available. We've got the technology to do a lot of things. But folks, when it doesn't rain, it doesn't work very well in the country. And we've learned that lesson over and over again. And we just went through about 3 or 4 years of it, depending on where you're from. When we get short of water, and I live in Wichita County in Iowa Park, and in Wichita Falls, we saw lake levels down below 20%. We were in dire straits. Thank goodness through some planning and having an RO plant on site and up and ready to go, we were able to divert what could have been a real disaster. But when you get into that scenario, you always start talking about interbasin transfer. That always comes up. Well, why can't we build a pipeline? They're flooding in East Texas and we're without. That's a tough issue. What's the future of interbasin transfer, guys? And any one of you can feel that. Is there potential there? Is there something that can be done? And is it something we need to pursue?
The conversation has started.
Yep.
So we need to see how we help direct that conversation. You know, James Frank said on natural resources as well.
He was in the middle of that.
And he's
He
right in
knew
the middle
exactly
of it.
what
We
was
knew
going
where
on.
to help you. And y'all's lakes are full now, thank goodness. But, you know, you also look at the opportunity. There was a lot of water in Oklahoma.
Right.
With no population that y'all possibly.
Absolutely.
So there's not only intrabasin and there's all kinds of options. Those options and studies need to take place because we know we will see a drought again.
Absolutely.
I don't want anybody here to have their water condemned or stolen. Obviously, you've got 3 on the panel that are adamant about private property rights, but where there's water, we need to find ways that we can work with our neighbors to ensure Texas is successful. We have that water for agriculture, industry, and a growing population. We'll always have the same 3 problems: water, education, and transportation.
Absolutely.
But the other 2 mean nothing if we don't have water, because if we don't have water, we won't have a population and we won't be able to grow the food and fiber we need to support not only this state, but the rest of this country.
So I hear you say that there is some potential, possibly, in the future for that sort of
Well,
thing.
to their point, our urban friends are going to push that conversation. And
Absolutely.
I don't want to be on the taking end. I want to be on the directive end to help them direct it, to make sure we're taken care of and we maintain the water in our rural parts of Texas. But if they're going to find a way to move that water, we need to be compensated fairly.
You know, it's interesting, gentlemen, that we start this discussion out pretty much with water, and we knew that was one of the places we were going to go just because of what we've seen. We've seen tremendous drought and then tremendous flooding across Texas. That's how volatile the weather is in Texas, and always has been, really. We've always faced that. We had the Lieutenant Governor in town a week or so ago on his tour to talk about the session. And he made the comment that if you want to get people stirred up, if you want to really start a debate and start a discussion, just mention water, and it's going to come to the forefront. And I think that's evident here this morning. It's one of the things that we need to talk about, one of the things we want to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about how we go about that fine balance of protecting those private property rights and yet having some control, some say over the water in Texas. Is there a balance there, gentlemen? We have, what, 140 somewhat water districts across the state of Texas. Some of them work better than others. Some of them regulate one area and some another. Do we need to go and look at that process across the state to try to find a balance between private property rights and water rights?
Sure, I'll talk about that. You bet. In my district, and just so you'll know, I represent Johnson and Bosque counties, which Johnson has the urban population of my district, and then Bosque County, which has the land mass of my district, is the rural area. About 2/3 of my district is rural, and then I have the very suburban part that's just south of Fort Worth. We have 2 different underground water conservation districts there, and I think that local regulation of groundwater is paramount. We've got to make sure that we keep the regulation local. Who knows best how to handle the water than the people that live there? And I'm going to go back to property rights eventually, but we've got to make sure that we ensure that stays intact. There's a lot of talk about, that's some of that is the biggest mistake Texas ever made was creating all of these little groundwater conservation districts and fiefdoms and all that. But you know what? that's where our property owners have their say, the people that live in that area. These boards are elected, and they decide the people decide how their water is going to be regulated. Now, it's apples and oranges the way it's regulated across the state. I mean, there's not really a cookie cutter, as you all know. If you talk to someone from West Texas and someone from East Texas and get them talking about their groundwater conservation district, they're going to go, "What? How do you do it like that? That's insane. That makes no sense." But that's the beauty of it, is we can tailor it to our areas. We've just got to make sure that our groundwater conservation districts are respecting the private property rights of our landowners. And if we can do that, then I think that's the best way to handle it.
Well, it's interesting that we have one agency in Texas that oversees all the oil and gas, and then we've got all these different entities that oversee water. And I guess the thought comes to mind, can we find some consistency? But when we do that, once again, I think this organization and many others, especially in rural Texas, boy, private property rights comes back, and we don't ever want to lose focus that that's where we are. So maybe there is hope to maybe stabilize that a little bit and make it work a little better. There was talk about brackish water and regulating brackish water in the session. We've got a lot of it in West Texas. It's available. It might be a resource somewhere in the future that could have big benefits when we get into one of these drought situations. We've kind of got the technology now to take care of it. I'm not sure what we do with the byproduct that comes out of it. I think that's one of the big questions now. And this is for all three of you. Chime in a little bit on the brackish water situation, how we regulate it, what your feelings were as we discussed that in the session, and where do we go from here?
Well, the original debate started out, do we manage brackish water different than the freshwater and aquifer? And I think our stance in this room and on this board here today was you manage the entire aquifer. But the numbers, was the science right? They threw out a big number of how many gallons or acre feet of brackish water there were. You're still, number one and two things we need to do with water, conservation, and we are going to have to lean on desal at some point. And to your point, what do we do with all the salt?
The byproduct,
It's going to be an interesting, but I think each region, groundwater district, we're going to have to find a way to incorporate desal if we want to continue to manage that aquifer as a whole. If not, this conversation will continue to pop up. But that was coming from our urban friends once again, and we defeated that measure. And something we need to talk about in interim, this group needs to have good policy on. We need to go in there with our guns and completely aligned. You've got a good team on the House side, and we need to discuss what we are going to do with brackish water.
Well, if you're on the Gulf Coast, your answers are going to be different than if you're in Amarillo.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, it's going to be a different approach, but that is a resource, and we'll be glad someday it's there. I really feel like the technology's coming.
Technology will catch up.
And the technology will catch up, and I think it's going to be an important part of the discussion. Let's shift gears just a little bit, and we can always come back, because the water deal is still one of the major I think topics for all of us. It's vitally important. Once again, it's the resource that we realize we can't do without. You had a terrible, terrible accident in West Texas, a couple years ago?
April 2013.
You remember very well. And the eyes of the nation were on that community, and miraculous recovery and miraculous efforts by people to come in and help, which is always what happens in Texas. That's the way we do that. We take care of our neighbors. But that brought a focus on a problem that could be existing in other areas and other towns, and you set out to do something about that. And of course, we're talking about the fertilizer storage bill. Talk a little bit about that, about how that impacted you. I know it was a horrible accident, a lot of people killed, a lot of them are first responders or volunteer fire departments. It really touched the heart of Texans and the people across the United States. How did you go about then to develop this legislation, and are you pleased with the way it turned out?
Well, first of all, yes, we're pleased and blessed that we have recovered. Our thoughts and prayers still with those families, and always enjoy going to West. But going back to our friends, nobody understands fertilizer or ammonium nitrate, not how important it is to agriculture, not how important it is to rural Texas, especially central Texas. And the day West fertilizer plant exploded, immediately, the state went into action, the chemists, the fire marshals, Human Health and Service. We started putting laws into place on correct storage. and began that conversation. The fire marshal did town hall meetings everywhere there was ammonium nitrate storage. We knew we had to keep that product available to our farmers and ranchers. We had to explain, most of the time, those first interim hearings, people just could not believe how much ammonium nitrate was at West. And I'm like, there's 2 farmers in West that could have hauled all that away in a day. It was
and a lot of people
springtime.
didn't realize how volatile it
Right,
was.
and
either,
depending on your soil and what it calls for, an analysis is very important. So we went into immediate effect redoing how we store ammonium nitrate. The fertilizer companies and their folks changed immediately. Just like any other farm or rancher, your house, you just start stacking things where you need them and you go and you do business. Now the storage requirements and the distances, the material that you have to build those facilities, that we codified state law immediately. We redid our website so folks that are concerned about ammonium nitrate know where it is located in the state of Texas. The agencies are working better together, the relationships, the state fire marshal, the state chemist, and every agency in the state of Texas, they have a working relationship. Your local fire department has the ability to visit with those facilities now and know what to do, where it's located in case there is a fire. This fire started in the feed room, and unfortunately we had a failure somewhere in the structure. Folks were adamant about metal and brick. And you still need wood because folks don't understand how corrosive ammonium nitrate is. And if you had a complete metal structure and you spent $2 million,
it would be gone.
That facility would be gone
yeah.
in less than 24 months. But good piece of legislation. Grateful for all the folks that were involved in helping us with that piece of legislation.
We're seeing the result of it already. There were already tours with both our professional firefighters and our volunteer firemen that have gone in and toured the facilities, found out what's there, what's on location, how would we approach it if we had a problem. And quite frankly, it's just one of those things that caught up with us, I think. But one of the fears that I had, and I think a lot of people in this room did when that happened, obviously the first concern is for the people involved directly. Second concern is what's that going to do to that availability of that product? Because we went through this in the Oklahoma City bombing years ago, and one of the things that you think about is, this is an input that we desperately need in agriculture, and it could very easily go away when you have that kind of thing happen. And hopefully your bill is going to keep that from happening and make that product available for us.
And that is our intention.
Yeah.
We didn't realize that the folks that harvest rock and aggregate use that product, so working with those stakeholders as well. Yeah. But it's important and vital that the agricultural community has an opportunity to get ammonium nitrate, and I think we did that.
Understand, Representative Murr, that you had an agritourism bill. Tell us a little bit about that. That's an area where I think a lot of producers are seeing some potential and probably need some direction and some leadership. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, this was also a bill that my predecessor had filed, and it just didn't get through the system in time. And that goes back to nearly 80% of all bills fail, so the system is designed to kill. So it takes a couple of bites at the apple to get there. But agritourism, as we've all experienced, we've seen an evolution in how land is managed and how agriculture, while playing a prominent role in land, is also now sharing that stage with recreation, period. You can call it hunting, fishing, bird watching, folks that just want to come out and see and be a part of nature because they don't get to experience it every day like a lot of us do. As a result of this, you're seeing an increase in business opportunities for folks to have pumpkin patches, to have mazes in which they allow folks to come on their property, bird watching, and some other agriculture-related activities. So if you want to stop on the side of the road and go pick your own watermelon, for example, and then along the way it's set up for you and your family to experience nature. If you fall down, you trip on a rock, a spider bites you, or you encounter some wildlife that you're not accustomed to, we don't want you as the landowner to be responsible for that. And law currently provides some protection for you if you've got folks that are hunting and fishing and doing other activities on your land. But it really didn't speak to this new industry that's popped up. So if someone wants to stop and pick pumpkins in your pumpkin patch and you're charging them money to do it, and then somebody gets stung or bit or falls down or breaks an arm, that landowner shouldn't be liable for that. And so we passed, in coordination with Senator Perry, we passed a bill that provides that level of protection now for Texan property owners. And I think going forward, you're going to feel even more confident to diversify what you do on your own property. So maybe part of the year you raise livestock or you raise crops, but then there's a certain time of year where folks can come in and recreate on your property, and you're going to charge them for that. And you're going to give them a good experience, and you're going to be protected from liability. So that was the end result there, is we want to make sure that landowners are safe whenever they allow a business opportunity to come in.
Interestingly enough, there do not seem to be accidents anymore. Somebody's liable for everything. That's the society that we live in, and maybe that will open the door for some people that were really interested in that. And I know of people that said, boy, I'd like to develop that. I'd like to, but I'm worried about it. I'm worried about the liability. I'm worried about what might happen. So that might open the door and move that forward. Gentlemen, there's another issue in the state of Texas that is always on the plate, and that's transportation. And it is my understanding now that we've changed things a little bit, and that we're going to actually maybe fund some of these TxDOT projects as we go and not borrow the money to do them. And I think that's a super move in the right direction. And I'll address this to all three of you, and however you want to handle it. Tell us a little bit about transportation. We're going to be investing more money in Texas roads. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I had the privilege and opportunity to serve as a member of the House Transportation Committee. And as far as the true freshman class, I think I was the only freshman on that committee. We heard a lot of bills, and one of them Representative Burns spoke of earlier that will be on the ballot in November for all of you to consider. It provides an extra $2.5 billion in funding to the State Highway Fund, and that funding comes from motor vehicle sales tax. There is a formula that would be in place for that. In addition, by 2020, the Legislative Budget Board would consider, if that constitutional amendment is passed, that we would be looking at an additional $3 billion going to transportation. Importantly, the budget that we also passed requires the State Highway Fund to only spend those monies for transportation. What that does is that ends diversions, and that's a common term that we use often, but maybe you don't understand as much. It's the same as what you do in your household. So if you've got something in your budget and it's only spent for this purpose, but then you come along, you're like, you know what, let's take a little bit of money out of that one line item. We're going to go spend that on vacation money.
But the air conditioner went out.
That's
right.
What
are we going to do?
So those funds are diverted out of the State Highway Fund to be spent for other allocations. Some of them were very, very relevant to all of us. For example, DPS. Well, we all agree DPS needs to be funded, but we didn't want to pay for DPS out of roads. It's basically your roads account. And so in that State Highway Fund, it will now solely be used for maintenance, repair, and construction of our infrastructure. And that's what we need, because I just drove in this morning, and I can easily find, along with all of you, many state highways that are in need of a lot of upkeep. And we have got to provide the level of funding. So I think with that constitutional amendment, you'll see one step forward. I think you're also going to see that this is a long-term discussion, and that additional stability is going to be needed in the future. But this is the first big step that the state needs to take. And then my companions may have additional insight on this.
He stole my thunder. That's what I was going to say.
I'll say this, in the 2013 session, we gave a proposition to the voters in November, and you told us transportation was important. We came back, we added the money, and we stopped the diversion from the gas tax. And that was huge. Transportation is important, and we're acting. And let's make sure this November we vote and keep that message coming to your legislature that transportation is important. And if you live in the Triangle, you're going to see a lot more money. I remember some of our members out of the Panhandle weren't so excited because they didn't think Amarillo and Lubbock were going to get all of those highway funds, and so they wouldn't help. But I think this plan will help move that transportation dollar across the state. and not just in that triangle.
Will there be funding for local roads? I know we've got some rural roads that are getting in pretty tough shape. We enjoyed at the county level what we call the CTERs, the money that came into the oil production areas where we had heavy traffic. And it's been a big help to county budgets. And it came at a great time because with all the flooding that's gone on, we've got some roads in terrible repair. But what can we do to help make sure that our rural roads are adequately funded? We love it when I-35 works, but there are other considerations out there for getting our crops to market and all that. Anything we can do moving forward to make sure that our rural roads are also taken care of? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll weigh in on this. So I had the privilege of serving as a county judge, and I've dealt with the headache of county roads, both paved and unpaved. And I can tell you that looking to the state of Texas as a resource in order to maintain county roads is never going to be a winning solution for the counties. You are right that was a big shot in the arm, but that was as a result of the oil and gas industry and the booms that were created in different regions of Texas. You're going to continue to see some deficiencies where those counties are still underfunded in trying to maintain those roads because they're not designed to carry the weight and the level of traffic that they're experiencing. Even with a little dip in oil prices and a slow in production, they're still experiencing the kind of use that maybe an interstate gets, not a Caliche County road. And even something with a 2-course coat on it, it tears up real fast when you put that many heavy trucks on it every day. As far as the state coming in to save the counties for that, I don't anticipate that happening. At the same time, I do think there are opportunities where the state and counties and county government can work together like the CTERS program.
Absolutely.
To accommodate specific regional needs based on unusual circumstances. So I'm hopeful that we will continue to see that level of goal-oriented solutions in the future, especially if we see our boom continue.
Absolutely. You know, and one of the things, not to beat up on the state, because we've had a very good working relationship in our county and several other counties with TxDOT. They help us a lot with some engineering needs that we need. They've certainly been good to send along some of their surplus materials that they have left, a certain amount of that. They help us with our bridge inspections that we have to do annually to make sure that things are safe. And, you know, one of the challenges that we're looking at in rural counties that I think is going to continue to be an ongoing problem with the growth in the population in Texas is as we develop the countryside and we build more homes out in rural Texas, those roads that were built specifically to get down for the old farmer and rancher to go feed his cattle, all of a sudden they're not designed for 2 SUVs meeting one another at 70 miles an hour. And we're getting use out of these roads, not just the heavy trucks, but just the amount of traffic that we've got out in the countryside now. And I think that's going to be an ongoing problem for us and something that we're going to have to face in the future and continue to upgrade that infrastructure. You know, interestingly enough, everything we talk about here today can probably be solved with money. That seems to be the magic bullet. You talked about the constitutional election coming up in November. Let's talk a little bit about that. What all is on that ballot? What do we need to be watching for? What specifically? You talked about one that's going to be important, and that's our highway funding, our transportation funding. What else is on that ballot that we need to be watching for and be active in?
Well, I know one that I think all of us were co-authors on is the right to hunt and fish in Texas. And that sounds, you know, people say, well, we can already do that in Texas. So why is that on the ballot? And Representative Ashby, who is a friend of ours, a friend of yours, filed a bill that will basically, if it passes, or it passed, but if it passes in November, will place in our Constitution that in Texas we have the right to hunt and fish. And today, that's not an issue. But if you look down the road 20 years from now, that could be an issue as the federal government continues to grow and, you know, overreach of federal agencies, especially into our personal lives and into our professional lives and our recreational lives, and a lot of times those are intertwined. It's important that we take a proactive stance in Texas and go ahead and say, in Texas, we're going to protect our right to hunt and fish. And so that will be one of the items on the ballot in November that I'll be supporting. And I can't remember, but I think both of you guys were on board with that one.
Absolutely.
As well. And so I would ask you to consider supporting that.
Well, one other of the 7 constitutional amendments that you'll consider in November will be to reduce your property taxes. And that one, what it will call for is it allows for an increase in your homestead exemption for your school property taxes. You having a role in county government understand that at the local level, the primary source of funding comes from property taxes. And the state of Texas collects $0 and is actually prohibited from collecting property taxes. So this constitutional amendment would increase your homestead exemption from $15,000 to $25,000. And that will be on the ballot in November, and I think it would take effect pretty darn quickly for a lot of people. I know that's something significant to a lot of people. Others will comment and say that won't really result in a great deal of savings in your pocket because your local government, or in that case your school district, actually sets your tax rate, and your appraisal district sets your valuation. So that does change things, but it's one attempt by the state to ensure that property taxes don't hit you in the pocket as hard as they do.
And you know, I understand, we've watched that one very closely, and being a county commissioner, it is our sole source of income, basically. We've got a few fees and other things, but it's a very important part of running county government, so we've watched it very closely as it went through, and I think we're in pretty good shape able to live with it. And we understand that a lot of that was not necessarily directed at rural Texas as much as it was some of the cities where we've got exponential valuations going up and creating some real problems. But yeah, we were keeping an eye on that one pretty close because it kind of hits close to home. And you would think that there's not very many people out there in a constitutional election that wouldn't want to vote for lower taxes. You know, that's probably a pretty good one to have on the ballot. But it's important that everybody understand what it is and what it will do, and the fact that we will be able to see our school districts still function and move along. Let's go back to the transportation deal just a little bit. And this is a tough one because it's like asking somebody to give you a break on a traffic ticket, and the answer comes back, well, which law do you want me to not enforce? That kind of thing. We've got some challenges in rural Texas on transporting our goods to market. We're just wrapping up wheat harvest that, by the way, has been devastated by the rain and flood in our part of the country. And we've had numerous situations where the overweight laws and other things that are applied have really created some problems. And we've seen, in fact, I had a custom harvester come to me and brought me some overweight tickets, and it wasn't that they were overweight, they were over axle. Trucks that were loaded in the field alongside the interstate, and just they pull out, and the DPS officer sitting there lights them up, and it's over with. And then they get to the elevator, and the ticket that they're paying off of, which I would assume is probably a good weight if you're writing a check on it, is right at 1,000 pounds different from what the total came up with the DPS guys got. And we're seeing that more and more often. Is there anything that we can do to give us some relief when you're loading a truck in the field? And I'm not advocating that we haul 150,000 pounds down a road. That's not good. I know that. It causes problems. It's a safety issue. But good grief, we need some help, guys. We need a little bit of help in getting these products out, because in most cases, time is of the essence. Thunderstorms are building, and you need to get that crop out, get it to the elevator, and not have those delays. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't even know what I'm asking for. But I think you guys at least need to be aware that it is a challenge for a lot of producers out there, and something that maybe down the road we could take a look at. Any thoughts?
We started tackling this in the interim because we had some issues hauling between Hill and McLennan County. So my constituents were hollering. During the session, we worked with Senator Nichols, and as we're talking about transportation and the roads and everybody faulting the oil companies and the roads tore up, it just wasn't real palatable. But we have the capability of hauling heavy. We know that our harvest seasons are particular months. So I will continue, and I know these two fine gentlemen will help with that conversation, to have special permits during harvest season and redo our axles and maybe distribute. And we have new equipment. I know we passed a law this year to let feedlots and vehicles of animal husbandry, so that we could get feed trucks and feedlots that are growing and move down the local highways, and they were getting ticketed in the Panhandle as well. And I think Our friend Charles Perry, who has arrived, helped us with that one as well. You know, like I said, thank goodness Charles was over on that other side. But those ag issues in haul-in heavy and haul-in harvest, then you bring in the timber guys as well. We've got to do something to get those products to market, but we've got to do our part, but we'll continue to have that conversation. It just wasn't palatable, like I said, because of the roads being in the shape they are.
And we don't want to advocate something that's going to jeopardize safety. We certainly don't want to do that. I don't know anybody that does, but we've got producers that have equipment in really good shape and really not creating a problem in any other way other than just, it seems like you're getting picked on, and that doesn't set very well with them. So anything that we can work toward in the future to get some relief on that, I think Farm Bureau would certainly be interested in that, and our constituency. And I want to open it up for questions from the audience if you start bringing them up. But I guess as we're getting our questions, the people coming to the microphones, and we've got them set up here, anything that didn't pass, gentlemen, that you feel strongly about in the session, anything that's left laying on the table? What about our eminent domain situation?
Well, yeah, I had a bill that didn't pass, and I know all three of us had bills that didn't pass. But
we didn't get anything vetoed, though, did we?
That's right. That's right. And it had to do with navigable streams, and that goes back to water. And we have talked a whole lot about water. Where I live in the Hill Country, folks have experienced examples, and I'll give you a generic example. Let's say we all recognize that large rivers are state water, and they call it a navigable stream. What I'm really talking about are creeks, springs, draws that run part of the year, where maybe a couple of generations ago you certainly assumed that was private property, and nowadays maybe you're not so sure that little creek is or is not. Typically what will happen is maybe a neighbor will call in on an enforcement issue. And they'll say, well, somebody's moving gravel around, or they've done something, blocked up the water upstream, and I'm mad, so I'm calling TCEQ and I'm complaining. TCEQ shows up, sees your creek, says, well, we're not sure that we have any authority here. We have to determine if it's a navigable stream. So, and this will surprise you as much as it alarms me, TCEQ will call up the state's authority on that, which is the General Land Office typically. And via either a couple of phone calls, maybe as formal as an email, they'll call up the GLO, and somebody who's very intelligent, the GLO, will look at Google Earth or some of the maps they have and say, yep, that looks like it's a navigable stream. And then from that point forward, TCEQ will begin an enforcement action and tell you can't move gravel around in your creek, or you can't impound water, or they're going to write you a fine and they're going to tell you to put it back. They're going to do these things. And all of a sudden, your whole world is turned upside down, and unbeknownst to your complaining neighbor, his is too. And so my bill, it didn't change the definition of navigable stream, because that's a conversation that's going to require a lot of interest groups, a lot of stakeholders. But what it did do is require that when that happened, and before TCEQ said yes or no to a navigable stream, that they had a public meeting in your county and made sure they sent notice to everybody around you to show up. And that gives you an opportunity to offer additional data, or maybe a survey from somebody who's very knowledgeable on the subject, to say, this is not a navigable stream. You cannot, raise an enforcement issue here. And we wanted that dialogue to happen, because otherwise your neighbors, everybody was affected by what TCEQ may rule. And then you may have a flood event, changes the whole course of the waterway, and a few years later it may not be a navigable stream anymore. So that was part of what I was going. It's a complicated process, but it affects so many of us. And it was really important to me and to a lot of folks back home. So. And
I suspect we'll see it again.
You will.
We can look for it. Gentlemen, anything comes to mind? Something?
Well, I have a couple things. I think you touched on the eminent domain bill, and I think that's something that we've got to work on, and I would love to see move forward. We've got to make sure that our property owners are dealing from the best position that they can when they're facing condemnation, whether it be from a utility, from a city, from whatever the entity is, and that they're being dealt with in good faith, and that that the wool's not being pulled over their eyes. And that's basically what that bill did. And I did pass a legislation, was signed by the governor, House Bill 4112, which basically it was a beautiful bill, I'll tell you that. But we whittled it down to about 8 words. It was a much bigger, a broader bill when we filed the bill, and what it did was it codified the results of the Day case, Day versus Edwards Aquifer Authority. And it said that a landowner, that first of all, we're going to observe common law in this state when it comes to water regulation, but also that a landowner has a right to their fair share to produce and maintain their groundwater. And a lot of those little words gave a lot of people a lot of trouble. And so in order to get the bill even out of committee, we had to chop a few words out of that. So the result was, in Texas, we're going to have to observe common law. But I intend to go back and fight for the producers, the landowners' fair share, and that's something that I'll be working on.
Very good.
I'll voice my disappointment with the eminent domain bill as well, but as a session draws on, relationships are altered, and sometimes the one carrying the bill is not in the same position they were. So hopefully next session, I'm looking at 3 capable authors of that bill, and hopefully we'll make sure it gets passed.
Well, it seems, just from my perspective, when you look at the eminent domain, whether you've got a government entity that's wanting to come in and take property, or whether it's a large utility company, pipeline company, whatever, the deck's kind of stacked against the little local landowner because they don't have counsel, on staff like some of those others do. And by the time you go out and hire counsel, it becomes overwhelming and pretty frightening, and there probably needs to be some provisions in there. And we appreciate the work you guys have done on that, something that we'll be watching very close as we move along. We've got time for questions from the floor. If you'd like to come forward, we've got microphones out in the back. If we've got a question, let's field some questions from the audience.
I'm Danny Schultz from Hill County. I don't have a question. I got a comment on the overweight axles. And what happens, you can load your truck legal, all axles, and all you have to do is make a sudden attempt to stop for somebody getting in front of you, and the load will shift enough to the front that it cause your driver to be overweight. And if DOT weighs you, well, you get a ticket up to depends how much it is. But you don't have to be overloaded with the whole truck, but just that one axle with the shifting of grain, you can pay a $750 fine.
Yeah. The new payment schedule is pretty frightening when you look at it for some of those overweight tickets.
And we did have a meeting with DPS and TxDOT and all those folk, all the stakeholders in the room, and tried to explain to them about shifting loads. And to your point, Barry, when you get to the elevator, your weight's right where it needs to be.
Yeah.
It's just a lack of understanding, but also an opportunistic opportunity for DPS.
And we understand using portable scales, they're not going to be as accurate because of the situation, but you wouldn't expect them to be that far off. And that, I think that's when you really, the red flags go up when you've got a real variation in weights. And once again, loading a truck in the field is an entirely different deal than trying to load it at the elevator where you've got the scales and a little more control on it. So once again, any help we can get on that would certainly make things operate much better in the country. Who's next? Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm Alfred Boyd, Fayette County. Getting back to highway funding, you guys are going to have a lot of money to spend, and the question is, what's going to happen in the division of all this money, the rural roads, state highways versus the population growth areas where the votes are? I read the papers, and the metropolitan areas are already planning on how to spend that money when they get it. So what's going to be left for the rest of us?
Gentlemen?
I'll make an attempt to answer your question. If you look at how TxDOT has broken down its districts across the state of Texas, most TxDOT districts are actually anchored out of a metropolitan or a large urban area. That being said, they are still responsible for all the roads in their district, including the rural counties too. Rural counties, based on population, we tend to get, and I claim one of them, where I live, as well as all of my district being rural, we get a lot less than what others do of that piece of the pie. You're going to see the same percentages remain as far as what the urban areas are going to consume of those tax dollars coming their way for infrastructure. Our goal, there was HB 20 was passed, and what it allows is an opportunity for there to be an advisory committee established to assist the Texas Transportation Commission and TxDOT in the priority and efficiency process. And part of that is how they go about selecting projects, and then once they select a project, sticking with it, sticking with the budget, avoiding changes and avoiding cost overruns. Those delays that they get cost more money. And so the hope is that this HB 20, which we all supported and passed, will allow for input into that process so that once they go in and they pick a project, we stick with it. And we stick with it and we get it done, and we don't let it linger and cost us a lot more money. That money is a loss to both rural and urban Texas. But at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that there is some balance. And sitting up here as three folks from rural Texas, you can rest assured that I know I have a lot of dialogue with TxDOT and with my district engineers in the 3 TxDOT districts that are across South Texas and the Hill Country and West Texas. So,
any other thoughts, gentlemen?
I'm just glad he hit on 20, and the transparency part of that is paramount to making sure TxDOT runs a clean ship. And the point of completion, if you drive up and down 35 between Waco and Austin, you know there's some completion issues.
And I just want to add, one thing you touched on is a good way to do that is another good way to ensure that the rural areas are getting the attention they need is to make sure your state representative is engaged with those district engineers. Andy knows his. I'm sure Kyle knows his. I know mine. And we meet regularly. My staff knows them. And so, we're able to go to them and say, hey, what about, down here in South Bosque County, we've got this issue, whatever. And I think that's another big way to make sure that the rural area, whoever your representative is, make sure they have that, they're aware of it, and make sure they have those relationships with the district engineers.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up on a break, but we've got time for another question or two as we wind this session up. So what's the question?
Okay, Billy Mann, not retired, but unemployed rice farmer in Matagorda County. What I want to talk to you about is our water issue. We haven't had water from LCRA since 2011. That was the last crop we had. And they established a cutoff in 2010 to 1.4 million acre feet. We have that now. Okay, on July the 1st, LCRA wants to address TCEQ to have them relieved of any obligation to send water to the lower counties. And there's some wells there's some rice farms down there now that the wells are straining to keep up with the crops. How did TCEQ all of a sudden get control of the water that comes down to LCRA? LCRA was created by you, the legislature, and it took 3 sessions to do it. And I can understand now why they were kind of hesitant to do this. LCRA has forgotten about the lower counties. We understood whenever there was a drought that we couldn't get water, but now we have the water. What can you do about it?
Here, you want me to start?
Yeah, you go ahead and start, Andy.
I'm going to start. First, I'm going to say it wasn't created by me because I wasn't alive at the time of creation. LCRA, along with all the other river authorities in the state of Texas, are going under audit and sunset review in legislation that the House and Senate passed. So that's one step in the process. I know it doesn't answer your question, but part of that process was to sit down and look at river authorities across the state of Texas, including LCRA, and see if they are being run the intended way and if there's inefficiencies in what they do. You have different stakeholders, and the rice farmers are one important part of that water process. You also have folks that either own property or utilize water upstream from you, and then you also have municipalities and urban areas that LCRA provides water and electricity to. You are always going to have conflict with that. I can tell you right now, I don't see that at the end of the day that it all gets resolved and everybody is happy. There's always going to be conflict. I can tell you right now that my staff and I are in the process of researching what is expected or intended to happen by LCRA's actions. Just because LCRA wants doesn't necessarily mean LCRA is going to get what they want. But they are asking a state agency for permission to do something. And that's something that downstream you should be very, very aware of. And I would also encourage you to talk to your state senator and your state representatives downstream to make sure they are engaged in that discussion at the agency and at the state policy level. That's something that I think is very important that you need to do. And these other gentlemen, they may also have some additional input on this.
You ready?
Go ahead. Well, yeah, what I was going to say is, and Andy touched on it at the very end, is make sure your representatives are engaged in what's going on upstream. Make sure they're engaged with the state agency, and make sure they're engaged with LCRA. That's, in my opinion, that's one of the biggest things you can do to make sure you're getting treated fairly and that your water rights are being honored.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Yep.
You have to develop those relationships.
Get some of the grease.
I'm surprised he didn't mention Dow in the senior right. And as I look to my right, I think I see Bob Reed out there. So I bet I'm going to get an earful about this here in a minute as my good state director. That's a tough question. TCEQ and LCRA and the sunset process is going to take a little time. So unfortunately, we're going to have a little more patience, and I hate that we have to answer that way. But we will dive into it and make sure we start that conversation with your senator and your state rep so we can aid in any help if there's a lack of understanding from a rural perspective, especially on rice.
We've got time for one more quick question, and then we're going to go to the break. Yes, sir.
Larry Winkleman from Washington County. Got a couple of issues. One is farm to market roads. I've been asking for shoulders to be put on our farm to market roads to closed ears. We need the shoulders on farm to market roads for farm equipment and bicyclers. We have a lot of bicyclers on them, and at the same time they increase the speed limit to 70 miles per hour on a road that's not designed for 70 miles an hour, and it doesn't have shoulders. Representative Murr, I'd like for you to speak on that as far as getting some of this money to go toward shoulders. And the other issue is when they build these freeways, is all the fancy artwork and stuff they put on there. My opinion is that money could be saved where you could stretch your monies out for transportation a little further. We don't need all that fancy stuff. Of course, I was told that's a federal issue, but I'd like to hear your remarks on that.
Sure. I'll start off with, I grew up on a farm to market road, and I also tell, for some of you, there's actually ranch to market roads. There's actually a distinction only in naming, and there are a handful of ranch to market roads, and they actually mean the same thing. So farm to market roads, in order for you to say improvements need to happen on a farm to market road, you need to be very engaged at the county level. You probably want to sit down and visit with your county judge, maybe bring it to the attention of Commissioner's Court, ask them to take action to formally request the state to make improvements. The second thing that you're going to want to do is engage in your area's state senator and state representative. They are going to, in turn, want to engage with TxDOT and your district engineer. A lot of times, speed limits are based on traffic studies. And so they've gone in there and they've done a study or more than one study to determine an increase or decrease in speed. If you believe the speed is too fast for the road and the roadway and the traffic that's on it, then your state representative, your county commissioner's court could even request a new study be done. Once that study's performed, you want to know the results of that. So that's going to go to speed. As far as shoulders, I don't see a lot of them. That is a discussion we would want to have directly with TxDOT. They have different classes and tiers of road systems based on your state highways, so we can always find an improved shoulder on a very nice state highway that you'll find, or a U.S. highway that they maintain. At the same time, it's pretty rare for you to find shoulders on farm to market roads, and so I don't know if that requires a reclassification of the road itself in order for them to provide that additional maintenance, which would be what you're asking. I haven't seen any shoulders on many of the farm to market roads where I live. So
A lot of it has to do with right-of-way.
it does.
The
And
width
so,
that's there.
so from that, it's the original intent of the road and whether a redesign would even be permissible. But to do those changes, you need to be talking to your county officials, and you need to have your county officials and you be engaged with your state representative so that y'all can dialogue with your district engineer and the experts that are the ones that help design, maintain, and repair those roads. Because if they don't know what's going on and they're not aware of your concern, your interest, and your complaint, nobody's going to do anything. And it's very important for you.
And to your point, our Commissioners Court actually petitioned TxDOT to change the speed limit on a local farm to market road and actually got it accomplished. So they're willing to work with you when you bring that.
That is your
up.
squeaky wheel.
There's your squeaky wheel. That's exactly right. Gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. We're up on a break and we need to give people a chance to stand up and stretch a little and get ready. We're going to continue this discussion after the break. I do want to inform you that to win that door prize that we're going to do immediately we get back in here, you got to be here to win it. So it might be your deal. So take a break, enjoy yourself, and then be back in here as we go again. Gentlemen, thank you so much for what you do. Let's give these guys a Texas Farm Bureau welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Barry.
Very good.